In 2012, a team of geneticists published a study on families from a hillside community in Hancock County, Tennessee. They had sequenced Y-Chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from the core family lines of a community that had been claiming Cherokee ancestry since before the Civil War. The expectation, shared by the researchers, by the community, and by every historian who had studied the question, was that the Native American signal would finally be confirmed. It was not there, not partially absent, not ambiguous, not there. When researchers find no Native American signal in a population that has claimed Cherokee ancestry for 2 centuries, the absence is not a statistical footnote. It is a specific finding. Cherokee DNA carries well-documented haplogroup markers, mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, and Y, chromosome haplogroup Q at high frequencies, that are essentially absent from the general European American population and would appear clearly in anyone with genuine Cherokee ancestry within the last several generations. The Melungeon families in the 2012 study carried none of these signals at frequencies consistent with the Cherokee claim. The study's lead researcher Roberta Estes described the finding plainly. The families historically called Melungeon are the offspring of sub-Saharan African men and white women of northern or central European origin. What the study found instead of Cherokee ancestry is a specific, measurable, and historically traceable signal pointing not toward the mountains of North Carolina but toward the tidal flats of Colonial Virginia, and through Virginia toward communities of freed African men whose descendants the slave era was slowly closing around. But the finding is not what the word nothing usually means in a genetics paper. To understand what it means here, you need to understand what the Cherokee claim was actually doing. The Melungeon communities of Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, and the surrounding hollows of the Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee border region were not a random collection of mixed-race families who happened to share a legend. They were a documented community with specific surnames: Collins, Goins, Gibson, Mullins, Bunch, Cumbo, Bass, Chavis, that appear together in court records, land grants, and census documents going back to the late 1700s. And from their earliest documented appearance in the historical record, these families were being asked to explain themselves to a legal system that was becoming increasingly hostile to anyone who could not be clearly categorized as white. The Cherokee claim was not invented by one family and spread to others. It emerged across multiple communities simultaneously as a response to the same legal pressure. In Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, free people of mixed racial ancestry occupied a precarious legal position that narrowed steadily through the antebellum period. The one-drop rule in various state-level formulations meant that a single documented black ancestor could void a marriage, remove voting rights, close schools to children, and in some states bar testimony in court. The legal consequences of African ancestry were existential. The legal consequences of Native American ancestry were significantly less severe. Cherokee ancestry in particular carried a specific cultural capital in the antebellum South. The Cherokee were the civilized tribe, literate, propertied, politically sophisticated. Claiming Cherokee heritage positioned a family as indigenous Americans rather than as legally endangered mixed-race persons navigating a racial classification system designed to destroy their civil standing. The community that would come to be called Melungeon had another option available: Portuguese ancestry, which several families claimed, or Moorish ancestry, or Ottoman heritage. But Cherokee was the claim that worked best locally, in the specific courts and census districts where these families lived and were being called to account for their appearance. And before I get to what the DNA actually found, there is something written in the census records that deserves its own moment, because the census is where the survival calculation becomes visible in the most specific possible form. The same Melungeon families appear in the 1830 federal census as free persons of color. In the 1840 census, the same households are listed as white. In the 1850 census, the same families appear as mulatto. In the 1860 census, they are white again. 4 different racial classifications, 4 consecutive censuses. The same people. The DNA study confirmed what those 4 reclassifications already implied. These families were not inhabiting a racial identity. They were negotiating one, and the Cherokee claim was the negotiating position that offered the best available protection in the specific legal environment they were navigating. Which brings us back to the haplogroups, because the specific signals the 2012 study found are the part that changes how the entire 200-year story reads. The male lines of the core Melungeon families carry Y-Chromosome haplogroup E1b1a at meaningful frequencies. E1b1a is the haplogroup most commonly associated with North African and Iberian populations. It is the haplogroup found at high frequencies in Portugal, Spain, and across the Maghreb. It is also found in sub-Saharan African populations, particularly those with historical connections to the trans-Saharan trade routes. In the specific context of 17th century colonial Virginia, E1b1a in a family line points not toward Cherokee territory, but toward a very specific historical community. The freed Africans and African Portuguese settlers who arrived in colonial Virginia and the Carolinas before racial slavery hardened into a permanent legal institution. The female lines of the core families carry European mitochondrial haplogroups H, K, T, J, consistent with Northern and Central European women. The genetic picture the study produced is specific. African or Afro-Iberian male founders who partnered with European women in colonial Virginia, whose descendants moved westward into the Appalachian Mountains as racial laws tightened in the coastal settlements, and who arrived in Hancock County, Tennessee by the early 1800s carrying a genetic profile that pointed in entirely the wrong direction for the identity they had adopted to survive. But the longer I stayed with the genetics, the more I realized the DNA was actually the simpler archive. The historical record, once you know where to look, is saying the same thing in considerably more detail. Historians Virginia DeMarce and Paul Heinegg spent years documenting free black families in colonial Virginia and the Carolinas. What they found was a specific network of families: Chavis, Bass, Goins, Cumbo, Bird, Gibson, who appear in colonial Virginia records from the 1640s and 1650s as free persons of color. Some were the descendants of Anthony Johnson, a freed African who had himself owned land and servants in Virginia in the 1640s before his family's land was seized after his death. Others were the descendants of African men who had arrived as indentured servants rather than slaves in the early colonial period, before the legal distinction between servitude and permanent heritable slavery had been fully codified in Virginia law. These families were free. They owned land. They appeared in court records as witnesses and plaintiffs. And then, over the course of the late 1600s and early 1700s, the legal environment around them changed. Virginia's slave codes hardened. The definition of who counted as black expanded. The privileges that free persons of color had exercised in the earlier colonial period were systematically curtailed. And these specific families, the same families whose names appear in the core Melungeon genealogies, began moving westward, into the mountains, into the hollows of the Virginia-Tennessee-Kentucky border, where the reach of coastal legal enforcement was thinner, and the question of racial classification was less immediately consequential. And here's what I find most extraordinary about this specific case, because the DNA is not the only record that noticed this. The haplogroup data points to colonial Virginia. The genealogical research by DeMarce and Heinegg points to the same specific families in the same colonial Virginia records. The census reclassification pattern, free person of color, white, mulatto, white, points to the same legal pressure those families were navigating across the same time frame. 3 independent archives built from completely different data, arriving at the same origin, the same freed African colonial families, the same Appalachian westward movement, the same survival calculation encoded in 4 different census classifications across 30 years. When genetics, genealogy, and census records all converge on the same finding from independent directions, the probability of coincidence collapses to nearly 0. The 2012 study did not discover something hidden. It confirmed something 3 other evidence streams had already been saying. In haplogroup frequencies, in court records, and in the pencil marks of census takers who could not decide from one decade to the next what category to assign to the same family's face. Every media report on the 2012 study framed it as an exposure. The Melungeon communities had claimed Cherokee ancestry. The DNA found no Cherokee ancestry. The claim was therefore false. That framing is accurate, but it is missing the only part that matters. The Cherokee claim was not made in confusion. The families who adopted it were not mistaken about their origins. They were families who had watched the legal definition of blackness expand around them in colonial Virginia, who had moved west ahead of the hardening slave codes, and who arrived in Appalachian communities already carrying the lived knowledge of what African ancestry cost in the antebellum South. The Cherokee claim was not a story. It was a calculation. The identity that offered the best available protection, valorized rather than criminalized, indigenous rather than enslaved, in the specific courts and census districts where their lives were being decided. The protection worked in one sense and failed in another. These families survived. They raised their children in communities where the racial classification was perpetually contested, but never finally resolved against them. The cost of that survival was specific. The actual origin story, which was not shameful but was legally dangerous, was replaced by a legend that was safe. And the legend was passed down until the original danger had faded, but the story remained. A ghost of a calculation that most families had long since forgotten needing to make. And here is the detail that changed how I read the entire story, the one that is not in the haplogroup data, and not in the census, and not in the Colonial Virginia genealogy. The DNA study did not expose what the Melungeon families were hiding. It confirmed what they had been protecting. There is a difference between those two readings that matters more than the science does. Exposure implies a secret kept out of shame. Protection implies a calculation made under threat. The same 4 census reclassifications, the same families, classified 4 different ways in 30 years, read differently depending on which frame you bring to them. As exposure, they describe a community caught in a lie. As protection, they describe a community navigating a legal system designed to punish the truth. The 2012 study produced a finding. The history explains why the finding existed to be found. The haplogroup is still there. The freed colonial Virginia families are still in the court records. The Appalachian hollows still hold the surnames. The Cherokee claim that protected a community for 200 years is still the most documented survival strategy in American racial history. All of it pointing at the same freed African colonial families who moved west ahead of the closing legal net, and whose genome kept the original record when the story was forced to change. If any part of this reached you, the families reclassified 4 times across 4 censuses, the freed black colonial Virginians the history books stopped following, the calculation that a community made and passed down until it became a legend. Drop the moment that stayed with you in the comments. A like costs nothing and carries more weight than most people realize for a channel doing work like this. Pass this to someone whose family has a story they were never quite sure about. Thanks for watching.